Welcome. Tonight, we travel together to the bottom of the world. The year is 1911. The place, a frozen continent where no human has ever walked to its center and returned. Over the next while, we will follow a small party of explorers as they journey across ice older than memory, toward a point on the map that had never felt a human footprint. This story holds hardship, it holds loss, but we will move through it gently with respect for those who lived it. There is nothing here that will startle you, no sudden sounds, no rush. Simply settle in, let your breath slow, allow your eyes to soften. We have time, we have quiet, we have a lantern to guide us through. Let your shoulders ease. We have all the time we need. In the opening years of the 20th century, the world's gaze turned toward the ends of the earth. The great continents had been mapped, rivers traced to their sources, mountain passes crossed and named. But two places remained untouched by human presence, the North Pole and the South Pole. These frozen extremities held the final mysteries of geography, and nations competed quietly for the honor of reaching them first. This was the Edwardian Age. In Britain, a young king had just taken the throne. Electric lights were beginning to replace gas lamps in London's finer streets. Motor cars sputtered alongside horse-drawn carriages. The world felt on the edge of something new, something modern, and yet the oldest challenge remained, to stand where no one had stood before. The poles captivated the public imagination. Newspapers printed breathless accounts of expeditions departing for the ice. Lecture halls filled with audiences eager to hear explorers describe landscapes of unimaginable cold. Photographs showed men in furs standing beside sledges, their breath frozen in the air, their faces weathered by wind. Why did it matter so much? Perhaps because the poles represented the last blank spaces on the map. Perhaps because reaching them required a particular kind of courage, not the courage of battle, but the courage of endurance, the courage to walk into emptiness and keep walking. For scientists, the polar regions promised knowledge. What creatures lived in waters beneath the ice? What rocks lay buried under glaciers millions of years old? What could the aurora tell us about the forces that shaped our planet? Each expedition carried naturalists, geologists, meteorologists. They gathered specimens and took measurements. They understood that even if they failed to reach the pole itself, they might return with discoveries that would reshape human understanding. For nations, there was prestige. Britain had long considered itself a seafaring power, its navy the finest in the world. The race to the poles was, in some ways, an extension of imperial ambition, though it was ambition turned inward, toward pure exploration rather than conquest. Norway, smaller but fiercely proud of its polar heritage, produced explorers who had grown up on skis, who understood ice and cold as intimately as breathing. The greatest Norwegian explorer of this era was Roald Amundsen. He had already navigated the Northwest Passage, threading a small ship through the frozen channels above Canada. He was methodical, experienced, unsentimental about the work of polar travel. His teams traveled light. They relied on dogs to pull their sledges, and they were willing to eat those dogs when supplies ran low. This was practical wisdom, learned from the Inuit peoples of the Arctic. British expeditions operated differently. There was a tradition, Some might call it romantic, others stubborn, that valued man-hauling, the practice of men strapping themselves into harnesses and dragging their own sledges across the ice. It was exhausting work, burning thousands of calories each day, but it was considered noble. It demonstrated character. It proved that British grit could overcome any obstacle. These philosophical differences would matter greatly in the years to come. By 1909, the North Pole had been claimed, though the claims were disputed, and the controversy would simmer for decades. Attention now focused entirely on the South. Antarctica, that vast white continent surrounding the bottom of the globe, remained almost entirely unexplored. A few expeditions had touched its edges, established temporary camps, pushed inland a short distance. But the pole itself, 90 degrees south latitude, the axis around which the Earth spins, remained unreached. The distance from the Antarctic coast to the South Pole is roughly 800 miles. 800 miles of ice, crevasses, glaciers, and wind. Temperatures that could drop to 60, 70, 80 degrees below zero. Blizzards that lasted for days, reducing visibility to nothing. And at the end of that journey, one would have to turn around and walk 800 miles back. It was not a journey to be undertaken lightly. Yet men volunteered. They wrote letters expressing their eagerness to be considered. They understood the dangers. Many had already served on polar expeditions and knew what awaited them. Still, they wanted to go. There was something in the human spirit, then as now, that yearned to see what lay beyond the horizon. In parlors and studies across Britain, maps were spread on tables. Fingers traced routes across the ice. The fire crackled low in the grate, and outside the windows, ordinary English rain fell on ordinary English streets. But in imagination, those rooms were filled with ice and wind and the vast silence of the polar plateau. This was the world that Robert Falcon Scott inhabited as he began planning his return to Antarctica. He had been there before, on the Discovery expedition of 1901 to 1904. He had seen the ice shelf and the distant mountains. He had felt the cold settle into his bones, and he had come home with an ambition that would not rest. The South Pole was waiting, and Scott intended to reach it. The fire crackles low. Outside, snow falls without hurry. Robert Falcon Scott was born in 1868 in Devonport, England, near the great naval dockyards of Plymouth. His family had served the Royal Navy for generations. The sea was in his blood, as natural as breath. He entered the training ship Britannia at the age of 13. A small, somewhat shy boy, he was not immediately remarkable. His instructors noted his intelligence but also a certain dreaminess, a tendency to retreat into thought. The other cadets roughhoused and boasted. Scott observed, considered, kept his own counsel. Yet he advanced steadily through the ranks. He studied hard. He learned navigation, seamanship, the 1,000 small skills required of a naval officer. By his late 20s, he held the rank of lieutenant and served with quiet competence aboard various vessels. There was nothing in his early career to suggest that he would become an explorer. Nothing to indicate that his name would one day be known around the world. He was simply a capable officer doing his duty, one among many in the vast machinery of the British Navy. Then in 1899, chance intervened. Scott learned that the Royal Geographical Society was planning an Antarctic expedition. Britain had fallen behind in polar exploration, and there was a desire to reassert national pride. A ship would be built, a crew assembled, a leader was needed. Scott applied for the position. He was not the obvious choice. He had no polar experience, no particular expertise in ice travel. But he impressed the selection committee with his earnestness, his organizational ability, his willingness to learn. He was appointed commander of the British National Antarctic Expedition. The Discovery Expedition sailed in 1901. For the next 3 years, Scott and his men explored the Ross Sea region of Antarctica. They established a base on Ross Island, within sight of the smoking volcano Mount Erebus. They made sledging journeys across the ice shelf. They collected scientific specimens. They pushed farther south than any humans had gone before, though they did not reach the pole. It was difficult, often miserable work. The cold was relentless. Equipment failed. Scurvy appeared among the men, that ancient sailor's curse caused by lack of fresh food. Scott himself struggled with the realities of polar travel, learning through painful trial and error. But he also discovered something within himself, a determination that surprised even him, a capacity for leadership that emerged under pressure. He was not a natural athlete, not a born outdoorsman. He was a naval officer who had trained himself through sheer will to endure. The men of the Discovery Expedition remembered him in different ways. Some found him distant, formal, too bound by naval hierarchy. Others saw beneath the reserve a genuine warmth, a dry humor, a loyalty that did not need to be spoken. He could be moody, prone to dark periods of self-doubt, but he could also inspire, particularly when circumstances were most dire. When Discovery returned to England in 1904, Scott was celebrated as a hero. He lectured to packed audiences. He published accounts of the expedition. He was promoted within the Navy. Yet even as he received honors, he was already thinking of return. The pole had eluded him. It sat there on the map at the very bottom of the world, unreached. The failure nagged at him. He spent the next several years serving in the Navy, commanding various ships. He married Kathleen Bruce, a sculptor and free spirit who understood his restlessness. They had a son, Peter, born in 1909. Scott was devoted to them both, writing long letters when duty took him away. But Antarctica called. It was always there in the back of his mind, the white silence, the untouched ice, the pole. In 1909, Scott announced that he would lead a new expedition. This time, he declared, they would reach 90 degrees south. They would plant the British flag at the bottom of the world. They would return with scientific knowledge that would benefit all humanity. His personality remained complex. He was sensitive about criticism, defensive about the difficulties of the Discovery years. He had studied the writings of other polar explorers carefully, noting their techniques, their mistakes. He believed he had learned the lessons necessary for success. Yet there were blind spots. Scott remained ambivalent about dogs as draft animals, a prejudice that would prove costly. He placed great faith in Siberian ponies, despite evidence that ponies struggled terribly in polar conditions. He trusted in the British tradition of man-hauling, believing that human effort and will could overcome any obstacle. His planning was meticulous in some ways, less so in others. He attended to scientific objectives with genuine passion, recruiting specialists in geology, biology, meteorology. The expedition would contribute to human knowledge regardless of whether they reached the pole. But the margins were thin. The calculations of food and fuel left little room for error. The equipment, though carefully selected, would be tested beyond its limits. None of this was apparent in the planning stages. Sitting in his study in London with Kathleen and young Peter nearby, with maps spread before him and correspondence piling on his desk, Scott saw only the goal. The pole was there. It was waiting, and this time he would reach it. He had no way of knowing that Roald Amundsen, half a world away, was making his own secret plans. That the race was already beginning, though Scott did not yet know he was in one. For now there was only the work of preparation, the ship to acquire, the men to recruit, the supplies to gather. The lantern burned late in Scott's study. Pages turned. Notes were made. Antarctica waited, patient and cold, at the end of the earth. Breathe slowly. We are only walking through memory. The ship they chose was called Terra, Latin for new land. She was a whaling vessel built in 1884, her hull reinforced to withstand the pressure of pack ice. Not elegant, not fast, but sturdy. Her timbers had already known polar waters. She had served on previous expeditions to both Arctic and Antarctic. The ice had tested her, and she had endured. Scott's team purchased her for £12,000 and immediately began modifications. Additional coal bunkers were installed. Scientific laboratories fitted below deck. The rigging adjusted. Every inch of space would be needed for the supplies required to sustain a party of 65 men for years in the ice. The work of preparation was endless. Lists were made and revised. Equipment tested. Correspondence flowed between London, Cardiff, New Zealand, and beyond. But the most important task was selecting the men. Volunteers came forward in extraordinary numbers. Over 8,000 applications arrived from sailors and soldiers, scientists and students, dreamers and adventurers. Each letter was read. Each candidate considered. The officers Scott chose were a mix of naval men and polar veterans. Edward Wilson, the expedition's chief scientist and artist, had served with Scott on Discovery. He was a physician by training, gentle in manner, deeply religious, loved by all who knew him. His watercolors of Antarctic landscapes would become treasured records of a vanishing world. Lawrence Oates, a cavalry officer, joined to manage the ponies. He was quiet, self-contained, with a dry wit that emerged unexpectedly. He walked with a slight limp, a war wound from South Africa, but his expertise with horses was unquestioned. Henry Bowers was small, fiercely energetic, seemingly impervious to cold. He would prove invaluable on the ice, his capacity for work almost superhuman. His friends called him Birdie for his prominent nose. Edgar Evans, a petty officer and veteran of Discovery, was chosen for his strength and experience. A big man, powerful, skilled with sledges and equipment repair. Apsley Cherry Garrard, young and somewhat nearsighted, joined as assistant zoologist. He had contributed £1,000 to expedition funds. Wealthy volunteers were not turned away, but he would prove his worth many times over. There were meteorologists, geologists, biologists. There were sailors and stokers, cooks and carpenters. Each man had a role. Each understood that the expedition's success depended on cooperation, on the steady performance of unglamorous duties. The ponies were sourced from Siberia, 19 of them, hardy Manchurian stock accustomed to cold. 33 dogs came from various sources, intended to pull sledges on depot-laying journeys. 2 motorized sledges, experimental machines with caterpillar treads, were also included. Scott believed technology might prove decisive. Supplies filled warehouse after warehouse. Pemmican, a concentrated mixture of dried meat and fat, would provide calories on the march. Biscuits, chocolate, butter, tea. Scientific instruments, clothing, sleeping bags of reindeer fur, tents, stoves, fuel, rope, skis, ice axes. Every item had to be inventoried, packed, loaded. The logistical challenge was immense. Funding was a constant worry. The British government contributed a modest grant, but most money had to be raised through private donations, lectures, and the sale of expedition rights. Scott spent countless hours writing appeals, meeting with potential sponsors, reassuring doubters. The stress showed in his letters. Delays frustrated him. Costs exceeded estimates. Equipment arrived late or proved unsuitable. He worked long days and slept poorly, the weight of responsibility pressing down. Yet there were moments of satisfaction. When the team gathered, when the ship sat fully laden at the dock, when the final preparations fell into place, in those moments, Scott could see the expedition taking shape. All those lists and letters had become something real. Terra Nova sat low in the water, heavy with her cargo. Her masts rose against the gray Cardiff sky. The crew moved about her decks, learning her ropes and rhythms. Families came to say farewell. Wives and mothers, fathers and children. There were handshakes and embraces, promises to write, assurances of safe return. Some of those farewells would prove final, though no one knew it then. The expedition had no single purpose. Yes, they hoped to reach the pole, but they also intended to conduct serious scientific research, geological surveys, meteorological observations, biological collections. Wilson was particularly interested in emperor penguins, those remarkable birds that bred in the depths of Antarctic winter. He hoped to study their embryos, seeking clues to the evolutionary link between birds and reptiles. This dual purpose, geographical conquest and scientific inquiry, defined the expedition's character. They were explorers, yes, but also researchers. The knowledge they gathered would outlast any flag they might plant. The harbor was calm the evening before departure. Lamps glowed along the docks. Men made final checks, wrote final letters. Terra Nova creaked gently against the pier. Tomorrow they would sail. The harbor is calm tonight. Ropes creak gently against the pier. On the 15th of June, 1910, Terra Nova sailed from Cardiff. Crowds lined the docks, flags waved, a band played. The ship moved slowly down the channel, her engines throbbing, her crew at the rails waving farewell. Britain receded into the summer haze. The voyage south would take months. First to South Africa, then to Australia, then New Zealand, then finally into Antarctic waters. Thousands of miles of open ocean, through calm and storm. The men settled into shipboard routine. Watches were kept, meals served. The scientists organized their equipment. The sailors tended the rigging. Below deck, the ponies stamped in their narrow stalls, unsteady on the swaying floor. Terra Nova was crowded, impossibly, uncomfortably crowded. Every space was filled with supplies. Hammocks hung in tiers. The smell of coal smoke mingled with animal scent and the salt of the sea. Privacy was non-existent. Yet a camaraderie developed. Men who had been strangers became companions. They learned each other's habits, tolerances, quirks. Card games passed the evening hours. Songs were sung, stories told. The ship touched at various ports along the way. Cape Town, Melbourne, Lyttelton in New Zealand, where final preparations were made. At each stop, there were receptions and lectures, dignitaries to meet, local volunteers to interview. The expedition was news, and newspapers reported every detail. It was in Melbourne that Scott received troubling word. Roald Amundsen, the Norwegian explorer, had announced that he too was heading south. The telegram was brief, almost curt. Beg leave to inform you Fram proceeding Antarctic. Amundsen. So there would be a race after all. Scott received the news with outward calm. He told his men that they would not alter their plans. They would proceed as intended, focusing on their scientific work and their own march to the pole. If the Norwegians arrived first, so be it. The expedition's value did not depend solely on priority. But the news stung. It changed the atmosphere, adding an edge of competition to what had been a purely British endeavor. Terra Nova sailed from New Zealand in late November, heading into increasingly cold waters. The temperature dropped. Ice appeared first in scattered fragments, then in larger flows. The ship pushed through, her reinforced hull grinding against the frozen sea. And then in early December, a storm struck. It came without much warning. The barometer plunged. The wind rose to a shriek. Waves towered over the ship, crashing across her decks. Terra Nova rolled terribly, her cargo shifting, water pouring into the holds. For 2 days the storm raged. Men pumped constantly, fighting to keep the ship afloat. Coal bags washed overboard. 2 ponies died in their stalls, unable to withstand the violent motion. A dog was lost to the sea. Below deck, everything was chaos. Supplies tumbled. Water sloshed ankle deep. The noise was overwhelming, wind, waves, the creaking of timbers under strain. There were moments when it seemed the ship would founder. Officers and crew worked without sleep, bailing, pumping, lashing down whatever could be saved. Scott himself labored alongside the men, his face gray with exhaustion. But Terra Nova held. Her old timbers, tested by decades of whaling, proved equal to the storm. The pumps gained on the flooding. The wind began to ease. When the skis cleared, the men emerged on deck to assess the damage. They had lost supplies, ponies, dogs, but the ship was intact. The expedition would continue. Ahead, the pack ice stretched to the horizon, a frozen labyrinth that had to be navigated carefully, searching for leads of open water between the floes. Progress was slow, sometimes measured in miles per day. The world transformed around them. The ocean turned from gray to a strange, luminous green. Ice took on shades of blue and white that seemed impossible, almost artificial. Seals lounged on floes, watching the ship pass with mild curiosity. Penguins dove and surfaced, their movements quick and joyful. The men stood at the rails, watching this new world unfold. Many had read about Antarctica, studied photographs and paintings, but nothing had prepared them for the reality, the vastness, the silence, the strange, cold beauty. Mount Erebus appeared on the horizon, a perfect volcanic cone, its summit trailing a plume of smoke against the pale sky. They were approaching Ross Island, the site of Scott's old Discovery base. Familiar landmarks emerged: Hut Point, the ice shelf, the distant mountains. The ship pushed through the final miles of pack ice and entered the open water of McMurdo Sound. On January 4, 1911, Terra Nova dropped anchor off Cape Evans. They had arrived. The work of unloading began immediately. Supplies had to be ferried ashore by sledge and boat. The ponies were led down gangplanks onto the ice, their legs shaky after weeks at sea. Dogs bounded about, excited by the cold and the space. Ahead lay the construction of winter quarters, the establishment of supply depots, and ultimately the long march south. But for now, there was simply the relief of arrival. The voyage was complete. The ice stretched before them, white and waiting. A lantern was lit that first night ashore. Its glow was small against the immense Antarctic darkness. But it was a beginning. Waves rocked the hull like a cradle. Let the rhythm settle you. They built their hut at Cape Evans, on a small spit of volcanic rock jutting into McMurdo Sound. The location was chosen carefully. It offered shelter from the worst winds, access to the sea ice, and a view of the route south. The men of the Discovery expedition had wintered at nearby Hut Point, but that old shelter was too small, too exposed. Cape Evans would become their home. The prefabricated hut had been constructed in England, disassembled, and shipped in numbered pieces. Now those pieces had to be fitted together in conditions far harsher than any English workshop. The work was exhausting. Timbers were heavy. Fingers grew numb in the cold. The wind picked up without warning, threatening to scatter materials across the ice. Men worked in shifts, pausing to warm themselves, returning to the task. Gradually, the structure took shape. Walls rose. A roof was fitted. Windows were installed, their glass offering views of the ice shelf and the distant mountains. The building measured 50 feet by 25 feet, not large for the 16 men who would occupy it through the long polar winter. Inside, carpenters built bunks along the walls. A long table dominated the center of the room, where meals would be taken and scientific work conducted. A darkroom was partitioned off for the photographers. A small area was designated for the acetylene generator that would provide light. And there was the stove. The coal-burning stove became the heart of the hut. Around it, men gathered in the evenings. Its warmth pushed back the cold that seeped through every crack. Its glow provided a focal point, a domestic comfort in an alien land. They hung photographs on the walls. They arranged their books. Each man had been allowed to bring a small library. Scientific instruments were unpacked and calibrated. The hut began to feel, if not exactly home-like, at least inhabited. Outside, work continued. Supply depots had to be laid along the route south, caches of food and fuel that would sustain the polar party on its journey and return. The ponies and dogs needed shelter. Scientific stations were established, meteorological screens, tide gauges, magnetic observation posts. The ponies proved troublesome from the start. They disliked the cold, the wind, the unfamiliar footing. Their hooves broke through thin ice. They required more care than the dogs, consuming precious time and energy. Oats, responsible for their welfare, grew increasingly pessimistic about their usefulness. The dogs, by contrast, thrived. They fought and played with equal enthusiasm, their thick coats proof against the cold. But Scott remained skeptical of their value for the main polar journey. Man-hauling, he believed, was more reliable, more suited to British temperament. The ponies would carry supplies to the base of the Beardmore Glacier. Beyond that point, men would pull their own sledges. The depot-laying journeys began in late January. Parties set out across the ice shelf, establishing supply points at intervals along the route south. These depots, marked by flags and cairns, would be critical for the return journey, when the polar party would be exhausted and desperate for food. 1 Ton Depot, the most important of these caches, was placed roughly 130 miles from the base. Scott had hoped to push it farther south, but the ponies were struggling and discretion prevailed. The depot's location would later prove fateful. As autumn approached, the sun began its long descent toward the horizon. Each day grew shorter. Shadows lengthened across the ice. The sea began to freeze, trapping the ship and cutting off any possibility of escape. The men prepared for winter. Coal supplies were inventoried, food stores checked. The hut was insulated as best as possible, with snow banked against the walls. They had arrived in summer's perpetual daylight. Now they would experience the opposite extreme, months of darkness, broken only by the faint glow of noon twilight. The Antarctic winter was approaching. The hut at Cape Evans became a small world unto itself. 16 men, plus the shore parties that would come and go. Their universe contracted to the dimensions of their shelter, the routines of their work, the company of their companions. Scientific observations continued. Wilson painted. Ponting, the expedition photographer, developed his images. Lectures were planned for the dark months ahead. The men read, played chess, kept journals. Outside, Mount Erebus smoked placidly against the darkening sky. The ice shelf stretched southward, a white road leading to the pole. But that journey was months away. For now, there was only the work of settling in, of making this frozen place as habitable as possible. The lantern in the hut window glowed against the gathering dusk. Inside, the stove crackled softly. Men bent over their tasks, their shadows moving on the walls. Home was far away, but they had created something like shelter in this most inhospitable of places. The hut door closes softly. Warmth rises from the coal stove. The sun set for the final time on April 23, 1911. It would not rise again for 4 months. The men of the Terra Nova expedition settled into the rhythm of polar winter. Outside, darkness was absolute, not the comfortable darkness of an English night, but something deeper, more complete. The stars wheeled overhead in patterns unfamiliar to Northern Hemisphere eyes. The temperature dropped to 40, 50, 60 degrees below zero. Inside the hut, life continued. The routine was essential. Without structure, the long darkness could become oppressive, demoralizing. So the days were divided into periods of work, meals, leisure, and sleep. Breakfast at 8, scientific observations throughout the morning, lunch, more work, dinner, evening activities, lights out. The scientific program was ambitious. Meteorological readings were taken at regular intervals, day and night. Simpson, the expedition's meteorologist, maintained a complex array of instruments, thermometers, barometers, anemometers. His data would contribute to understanding of Antarctic weather patterns for decades to come. Wilson continued his biological work, preparing specimens collected during the summer months, planning the research to come. He also painted, capturing the subtle gradations of twilight that appeared briefly at midday, the aurora that sometimes flickered overhead. Ponting, the photographer, developed his images in the small darkroom. His work, both still photographs and moving pictures, would become the most complete visual record of any polar expedition. He photographed everything: the men at work, the animals, the ice formations, the daily life of the hut. In the evenings there were lectures. Each man with scientific expertise was expected to present his work to the others. Simpson spoke on meteorology, Wilson on Antarctic wildlife, Wright on glaciology, Nelson on marine biology. The lectures were educational but also social, a way of passing the long hours and sharing knowledge. There were also entertainments. A newspaper was produced, the South Polar Times, following a tradition from the Discovery expedition. It contained essays, poems, drawings, jokes. The men contributed pseudonymously, poking gentle fun at each other and at the hardships of their situation. Gramophones provided music. Favorite records were played until they wore thin. Songs were sung, often bawdy, sometimes sentimental. Birthdays were celebrated with whatever treats could be improvised from the stores. Midwinter's Day, June 22, was the great holiday. The sun had reached its lowest point. From now on, each day would bring a few more minutes of light. A feast was prepared, the best the cooks could manage. Toasts were raised, spirits were high. But the darkness took its toll. Some men grew quiet, withdrawn. The cold seeped into everything. Condensation from breath and cooking froze on the walls, creating a layer of ice that had to be constantly scraped away. Going outside, even briefly, required elaborate preparation, multiple layers of clothing, careful protection of exposed skin. The ponies suffered in their ice stable. The dogs, better adapted, remained outside, curled in the snow. The men checked on them regularly, maintaining the routines of care that would keep the animals alive until spring. There were conflicts, small frictions inevitable when men live in close quarters for months on end. Personality clashes, disagreements over trivial matters that seemed, in the confinement of the hut, enormously significant. Scott's journals record moments of tension, quickly smoothed over but never entirely forgotten. Yet there was also remarkable camaraderie. Cherry Garrard would later write that he never knew a happier time than that winter at Cape Evans. The shared purpose, the shared hardship, created bonds that transcended ordinary friendship. These men depended on each other in ways that civilian life rarely required. The preparations for the polar journey continued. Sledging rations were calculated and recalculated. Equipment was tested, repaired, improved. Route plans were discussed. Every contingency was considered, or so they believed. Scott spent hours in his small cubicle at the end of the hut, writing, planning, worrying. The responsibility weighed on him. If the expedition failed, it would be his failure. If men died, their deaths would be on his conscience. He slept poorly, rose early, worked late. The lantern in his cubicle burned long into the night. Its light was visible from the main room, a reassurance that the leader was awake, was working, was carrying the burden so that others could rest. Slowly, imperceptibly at first, the darkness began to lift. In August, a faint glow appeared on the northern horizon at midday. The men emerged from the hut to watch it, standing in the bitter cold, their breath freezing in the air. The sun was returning. Spring was coming, and with it the journey south. Darkness holds no harm here. It is simply a quieter shade of waiting. Before the polar march could begin, there was another journey to make. Edward Wilson had long been fascinated by emperor penguins, those remarkable birds that breed in the depths of Antarctic winter, when temperatures drop below -70 and the darkness is complete. He believed that studying their embryos might reveal evolutionary secrets, links between birds and their reptilian ancestors. No one had ever visited an emperor penguin colony in winter. The idea was almost absurd, to travel across the ice barrier in total darkness, in the coldest conditions on Earth, for the sake of a few eggs. Yet Wilson was determined, and Scott, recognizing the scientific value, gave his blessing. On June 27, 1911, 3 men set out from Cape Evans: Wilson, Henry Bowers, and Apsley Cherry Garrard. They hauled sledges laden with supplies, heading east toward Cape Crozier, where the penguin colony was known to exist. The journey that followed was, in Cherry Garrard's later words, the worst journey in the world. The temperatures were beyond anything they had experienced. -60, -70, so cold that their teeth cracked, so cold that their sleeping bags froze solid each night and had to be forced open each morning. The effort of climbing into those frozen bags was itself exhausting. They traveled in darkness, navigating by stars and instinct. The sledges were heavy, the pulling brutal. Progress was measured in fractions of miles per hour. At night they pitched their tent, lit the Primus stove, melted snow for water. The warmth lasted only as long as the flame burned. When they extinguished it to conserve fuel, the cold returned immediately, absolute. Cherry Garrard's glasses frosted over constantly. He was severely nearsighted without them, nearly blind. He stumbled along, trusting his companions to guide him. Bowers seemed almost impervious to the cold. His small body generated heat efficiently. He kept moving when others faltered. His cheerfulness in the face of misery was both inspiring and slightly unnerving. Wilson endured with quiet faith. He believed the scientific reward justified the suffering. The embryos would answer questions that had puzzled naturalists for decades. After 3 weeks of travel, they reached Cape Crozier. The penguin colony was there, huddled on the ice in the darkness, the birds incubating their eggs on their feet to keep them from freezing. It was a scene of otherworldly beauty and strangeness. They collected 3 eggs. Only 3, the conditions made more impossible. And then their tent blew away. A storm struck without warning, winds of hurricane force tearing the canvas from its moorings. The 3 men lay in their sleeping bags, unprotected as the blizzard raged around them. Snow buried them. They could not move, could not escape. They simply waited, expecting to die. But the storm passed. The tent was found, improbably, a quarter-mile away, caught on a rock. They retrieved it, repaired it as best they could, and began the journey home. The return was no easier than the outward march. The cold continued. Their strength was failing. The sledges seemed heavier with each passing day. On August 1, they staggered back into the Cape Evans hut. They had been gone 5 weeks. They looked like ghosts, gaunt, frostbitten, barely able to stand. Cherry Garrard would suffer the effects of that journey for the rest of his life. But they had the eggs, and Wilson had proven that the journey was possible, that men could survive even the worst that Antarctica offered. Of the 3 eggs, only 2 would survive to reach England, and the embryological questions Wilson hoped to answer would remain largely unanswered. The science of evolution had moved in different directions. But the journey itself became legend, a testament to endurance, to scientific devotion, to the bonds between 3 men who trusted each other absolutely. A lantern flickered in the hut as they returned. Warm food was prepared. Sleeping bags, real sleeping bags, not frozen coffins, awaited. They had gone to the edge and come back. Their lantern flickers. You may rest your eyes a moment. Spring returned to Cape Evans. The sun climbed higher each day. The ice began to soften. The world that had been locked in frozen darkness came alive again. The men felt the change in their spirits. After months of confinement, there was work to be done outdoors, sledges to prepare, supplies to organize, routes to plan. The polar journey would be the expedition's culmination. Everything else, the scientific work, the winter survival, the depot laying, had been preparation for this moment. Now the moment was approaching. Scott's plan was complex. Multiple parties would set out together, leapfrogging across the ice barrier, establishing depots and supporting the polar team. As supplies dwindled and the going grew harder, supporting parties would turn back, leaving the final group to push on alone. The motor sledges would go first, hauling heavy loads as far as they could manage. Then the ponies, carrying supplies to the base of the Beardmore Glacier. Finally, the dogs, assisting with the glacier ascent. Beyond the glacier, on the high polar plateau, men would haul their own sledges. No machines, no animals, just human muscle and determination. The calculations were precise. So many miles per day, so many calories consumed, so much fuel for cooking. The margins were tight, with little room for delays or mishaps. Scott agonized over the details. Who would be in the final polar party? How many should there be? 4 had always been the plan, but the selection was not yet made. The men trained and wondered, each hopping to be chosen for the ultimate honor. The ponies were in poor condition. The winter had been hard on them. Oates, who knew horses better than anyone, was pessimistic about their chances. But they would be used as long as possible, then shot for food at the base of the glacier. The dogs were stronger, but Scott still doubted their reliability for the long polar march. Amundsen was known to be using dogs extensively, the Norwegian approach. Scott would rely on men. Meanwhile, news arrived that Amundsen had established his base at the Bay of Whales, 60 miles closer to the pole than Cape Evans. The Norwegian had a geographical advantage, and he had over 100 dogs. The race was real now. Scott tried to maintain his focus on scientific work, on the expedition's broader purposes. But the knowledge that Amundsen was out there, perhaps already marching, added urgency to every preparation. Sledging parties went out in September and October, laying additional depots, testing equipment, conditioning the ponies. The returns were mixed. The motor sledges performed poorly, the ponies struggled. But the men were ready. After months of waiting, they were eager to begin. Scott finalized his plans. The departure date was set for November 1, 1911. 16 men would set out initially, with supporting parties turning back at predetermined points. The final polar party would consist of 4 or 5 men. Scott had not yet decided. The hut bustled with activity. Sledge runners were checked and rechecked, sleeping bags aired, rations packed in precise quantities, maps consulted, routes traced with careful fingers. Letters were written, letters to be left behind, letters that might not be read until the writers returned, or did not return. No one spoke of this possibility directly, but it hung in the air. They were going into the unknown. Some of them might not come back. On the evening of October 31, a special dinner was prepared. Toasts were raised, good wishes exchanged. In the morning, they would begin. The lantern burned late that night. Men checked their gear one final time. Outside, the ice waited. The sun hung low on the horizon, circling but never quite setting. The polar summer had begun. The sun returns low on the horizon. No need to rush toward it. On November 1, 1911, the southern journey began. The motor sledges had departed a few days earlier, mechanical pioneers sent to break trail and haul supplies. The sound of their engines, strange and incongruous in that frozen silence, faded quickly into the distance. Now the main party followed, 10 ponies pulling sledges, 23 dogs in 2 teams, 16 men, some skiing, some walking, all moving south. The procession stretched across the ice barrier like a column of ants crossing a vast white tablecloth. From a distance, they would have been nearly invisible, tiny dark specks against an immensity of snow and sky. The first days were demanding but manageable. The ice was relatively smooth, the weather clear. The ponies plodded forward, their breath freezing in clouds around their muzzles. The dogs pulled eagerly, their energy seemingly boundless. The men fell into the rhythm of polar travel. March for a set number of hours, stop, make camp, pitch the tent, cook a meal on the Primus stove, eat, sleep, rise, repeat. The rations were carefully measured. Pemmican, that dense mixture of dried meat and fat, provided the bulk of their calories. Biscuits offered carbohydrates. Tea gave warmth and comfort. The meals were monotonous but sustaining. Each night after the cooking was done, the men crawled into their sleeping bags, reindeer fur, designed to retain body heat. Sleep came quickly to exhausted bodies. Morning came too soon. The motor sledges proved disappointing. They broke down repeatedly, their engines unable to cope with the cold. Eventually, they were abandoned, their promise of mechanical assistance unfulfilled. The ponies and dogs would carry the burden. As the days passed, the party moved steadily south. Depots were reached and passed. Cairns of supplies left the previous autumn. The names marked progress: Corner Camp, Bluff Depot, 1 Ton Depot. Each cache provided additional food and fuel for the journey ahead. The ice barrier stretched endlessly before them. The terrain was flat, almost featureless, a frozen desert of snow. The only landmarks were the distant mountains to the west, their peaks catching the low Antarctic sun. The polar party was not yet selected. Scott observed his men as they marched, assessing their strength, their endurance, their spirit. Who would falter? Who would thrive? The decision would be made later at the base of the glacier. Wilson, reliable as always, kept his own counsel. Bowers seemed tireless, hauling more than his share without complaint. Oates nursed the ponies with grim determination, knowing they would not last much longer. Evans was strong, a powerful sledge hauler. And the others, Cherry Garrard, Wright, Atkinson, the supporting parties, each played their role, each contributed to the slow progress south. The weather held mostly. There were days of wind and drift, when visibility dropped to nothing and the column stopped. Men and animals huddled together against the cold. But the major storms held off. The ponies struggled. Their hooves broke through the surface crust, sinking into softer snow beneath. Each step was an effort. Their ribs showed through their shaggy coats. Oates watched them with increasing concern. Still they pressed on, mile after mile, day after day. The pole lay somewhere ahead, invisible, abstract, a point on a map that had never known a human footprint. At night, before sleep, Scott wrote in his journal. He recorded distances, temperatures, observations. He noted the condition of men and animals. He reflected on the journey ahead. The lantern cast a small circle of light inside the tent. Outside, the ice stretched away in all directions, blue-white under the midnight sun. The world was reduced to essentials: snow, sky, the next day's march. They were committed now. No turning back. The pole waited, and they would reach it or fail in the attempt. Footsteps pressed into the soft snow. Each step was its own small arrival. Each step brought them closer to the heart of the continent. Footsteps press into soft snow. Each step is its own small arrival. The ice barrier stretched 400 miles from the edge of Ross Island to the base of the Beardmore Glacier. 400 miles of frozen plain, flat as a table, white as paper. The men crossed it slowly, steadily, day after day. 10 miles on a good day, 8 on a difficult one, sometimes less when storms pinned them in their tents. The routine of polar travel became automatic. Wake at a set hour, though morning was meaningless when the sun never set. Eat breakfast, pemmican, biscuit, tea. Pack the sledges. Harness the ponies, the dogs set out. March for hours, following the compass south. The ice provided no landmarks, no distinguishing features. 1 mile looked exactly like the last. The only measure of progress was the sledge meter, a wheel that counted revolutions and translated them into distance. Stop for lunch. More pemmican, more biscuit, perhaps a few squares of chocolate. Rest briefly. Resume. March until the designated hour. Stop. Pitch the tent. Unharness the animals. Cook dinner. Eat. Record the day's observations in journals. Sleep. The simplicity was deceptive. Each task required effort in the cold. Fingers fumbled with frozen straps. Stoves took long minutes to light. The cooking melted snow for water. A gallon required an hour's worth of fuel. Nothing was easy. The ponies continued to decline. The surface conditions were terrible for them. The crust would support a man on skis, but not a 1,000-pound horse. Each pony sank to its knees, struggling to free itself, exhausting its strength. Oates walked beside them, urging them on, knowing they had only days left. One by one, the ponies failed. They were shot as humanely as possible, their meat butchered and cached for the return journey. It was grim work, hated by all who had to do it. But it was practical. The meat would sustain the men when other rations ran low. The dogs, better suited to the conditions, pulled strongly. But their handlers were instructed to turn back at the glacier's base. Only men would make the final ascent. The supporting parties began to peel away. As each milestone was reached, a group would turn north, heading back to Cape Evans. They carried messages, collected specimens, laid additional depots for the return. With each departure, the polar party grew smaller. The responsibility concentrated on fewer shoulders. The weight on the remaining sledges increased. Scott still had not announced his final selection. The men speculated quietly among themselves, wondering who would be chosen, hopping for the honor. It was the greatest prize any of them could imagine, to stand at the bottom of the world. The weather remained tolerable for Antarctica. Temperatures hovered around -20, cold but manageable. The sky was often clear, the sun circling the horizon in its endless summer arc. When clouds gathered, the world became featureless, a white void without shadow or definition. They passed the depots they had laid the previous autumn. Each cache was welcome, additional food, additional fuel. But the distances between depots seemed to grow longer as men and animals tired. Scott recorded his observations meticulously. Wind direction, surface conditions, the behavior of the sledges, the mood of the men. He was compiling a record that might guide future expeditions, might contribute to polar science long after his own journey ended. At night, crammed into the tent with his companions, he allowed himself moments of hope. They were making good time. The glacier was approaching. The pole was still far, but it was possible. He did not yet know that Amundsen was ahead of him. The Norwegian had departed earlier with a different strategy, a different rhythm. By the time Scott reached the barrier's edge, Amundsen would be nearing the pole itself. But Scott did not know this. He could only know his own journey, his own progress, his own men. The tent canvas rippled in the wind. Inside, a small flame warmed cold hands. Outside, the barrier stretched on, patient, indifferent, waiting to be crossed. The tent canvas ripples. Inside, a small flame warms cold hands. The Beardmore Glacier was the gateway to the polar plateau. Rising from the ice barrier, it climbed over 10,000 feet in 120 miles, a frozen river of ice pouring down from the interior highlands. To reach the pole, they had to ascend it. The approach was spectacular. Mountains rose on either side, the Queen Alexandra Range and the Queen Maud Range, their peaks catching the sun, their slopes striped with rock and ice. After weeks of featureless barrier, the scenery was almost overwhelming. But the ascent was brutally difficult. The surface alternated between smooth blue ice and fields of sastrugi, ridges of hardened snow carved by the wind. The sledges caught on these ridges, requiring constant maneuvering. The men slipped and fell on the ice, struggling to find purchase. Crevasses appeared, cracks in the glacier's surface that could swallow a man without warning. Some were visible, their edges marked by shadow. Others were hidden beneath snow bridges that might or might not hold. The men roped themselves together so that if one fell through, the others could arrest his descent. The ponies were gone now, shot at the glacier's base. Their meat was cached in depots. From here on, only dogs and men. And soon the dogs too turned back. Mears and Dimitri, the dog handlers, were sent north with the surviving animals. The polar party would man haul from here, men in harnesses, dragging their sledges behind them. It was exhausting work. The gradient was steep, the sledges heavy. Each step required effort. The altitude began to tell. At 8, 9, 10,000 feet, the air grew thin and lungs labored for oxygen. Yet the men pressed on. They had no choice. The pole was still hundreds of miles away. Every day of delay risked being caught by the autumn storms that would end all travel. Supporting parties continued to turn back. Atkinson led one group north. Wright led another. Each departure was somber, handshakes, good wishes, the knowledge that they might not meet again. Scott was still deliberating. How many in the final party? Tradition suggested 4, a tent of 4 men traveling light and fast, but Scott was considering 5. The extra man would mean more weight, more food consumed, but it would also mean more strength for hauling, more security in case of accident. The decision weighed on him. The glacier revealed new obstacles daily. Pressure ridges where the ice buckled and fractured. Ice falls where the surface dropped away in frozen cascades. Each challenge required time, energy, patience. Wilson suffered from snow blindness, a painful inflammation of the eyes caused by the intense glare of sun on ice. He treated himself with zinc sulfate drops, pressing on despite the discomfort. Others developed frostbite on fingers and toes. Bowers remained indomitable. He seemed to grow stronger as others tired. His diary entries were cheerful, matter-of-fact, as if this terrible ascent were merely an interesting outing. Evans, the big petty officer, hauled mightily. His strength was invaluable on the steeper sections, but the altitude affected him more than the others. He who was accustomed to sea level, to the comfortable weight of his own body. Oates, without his ponies now, joined the hauling parties. His cavalry legs were unused to this kind of labor, but he did not complain. They climbed. Day after day they climbed. The barrier fell away below them, vanishing into the northern haze. Ahead the glacier rose toward the plateau. And at last they crested the summit. The Beardmore was behind them. The polar plateau stretched ahead, an immense, flat, frozen desert at the top of the world. The air was thin and cold. The wind cut through their clothing, but they had made it. The final march could begin. Ice groans beneath them, ancient and patient. We are patient too. The polar plateau was unlike anything they had encountered. At an altitude of over 10,000 feet, it stretched hundreds of miles in every direction. A frozen highland so vast, so empty, that the eye struggled to find purchase. There were no mountains, no crevasses, no features of any kind. Only snow and sky, meeting at a horizon that never seemed to grow closer. The cold was intense, -30, -40. The thin air made breathing difficult. Every exertion left them gasping. They hauled their sledges south, following the compass. The surface was hard, sculpted by endless wind into waves of frozen snow called sastrugi. The sledge runners caught on these ridges, requiring constant effort to keep moving. Progress was slow. The altitude sapped their strength. The cold drained their warmth. The monotony numbed their minds. But they pressed on, 90 miles to the pole, 80, 70. The final support party had turned back, leaving 5 men to make the last push. Scott had made his decision, controversial then, debated ever since. The polar party would consist of himself, Wilson, Oates, Bowers, and Evans. 5, not 4. The extra man meant recalculating rations, meant crowding into a tent designed for 4, meant additional strain on already stretched supplies. But Scott wanted these men with him, trusted these men, could not bear to send any of them back. They marched in a line, hauling together. The sledge weighed over 600 pounds now, less than at the journey's start, but still brutally heavy at altitude. Wilson walked despite snow blindness. His eyes streamed with tears that froze on his cheeks, but he did not slow. Bowers, the shortest of them, somehow seemed the strongest. He hauled with ferocious energy, singing under his breath. Evans struggled. The altitude told on him, headaches, weakness, confusion. He had cut his hand on the glacier and the wound was slow to heal, but he kept moving. Oates suffered silently. His feet, frostbitten earlier, were growing worse. He told no one how bad they really were. Scott felt the weight of command. Every decision was his. Every miscalculation would be his fault. He slept poorly, woke early, drove himself harder than any of them. The pole was close now. They could feel it, not physically, of course, but psychologically. The end point of their journey, the goal they had pursued for over 1,000 miles. What would they find there? Empty ice, certainly. But would they also find evidence of Amundsen? Had the Norwegian beaten them? They did not speak of this much, but the question hung in the air, unvoiced. The days blurred together. March, camp, sleep, march again. The sun circled endlessly, never setting, never providing the punctuation of true night. Time became elastic, meaningless. Scott's diary entries grew shorter, more focused. He recorded temperatures, distances, conditions. The prose was spare, almost telegraphic. There was no energy left for eloquence. 60 miles, 50, 40. The pole was waiting. They would reach it. They knew that now. Whether they would be first was beyond their control. They hauled on, 5 men against the emptiness, 5 small figures on the vast white plain. The lantern in their tent burned low at night. Outside, the wind moaned across the plateau, carrying crystals of snow that hissed against the canvas. They were so close now, so very close. Altitude thins the air. Slow your breath. There is no hurry here. On January 17, 1912, the 5 men reached the South Pole. They had traveled over 800 miles. They had crossed the ice barrier, climbed the Beardmore Glacier, traversed the polar plateau. They had endured temperatures of -40, winds that cut through every layer of clothing, altitude that left them gasping for breath. And now they stood at 90 degrees south latitude, the axis of the Earth, the bottom of the world. But they were not first. The evidence was unmistakable. A black tent stood against the snow, its fabric weathered but intact. A Norwegian flag hung from a pole beside it. Ski tracks led away in multiple directions. Paw prints of dogs marked the surface. Roald Amundsen had been here. He had arrived 34 days earlier on December 14, 1911. He had planted his flag, taken his observations, and departed. The race was over. Scott's diary entry for that day was brief, almost terse. The worst has happened. He wrote of the terrible disappointment, of dreams shattered after years of planning and months of brutal effort. The men stood in silence around the Norwegian tent. Inside, they found a letter from Amundsen, addressed to King Haakon of Norway, with a request that Scott deliver it should the Norwegian party fail to return. There were also discarded items, clothing, equipment, left behind as unnecessary for the journey home. It was a strange moment. They had achieved something remarkable, only the second party in human history to reach this point. But second was not first. The prize they had sought belonged to another. Wilson, ever steady, reminded them of their scientific mission. They were here to gather data, to contribute to human knowledge. That purpose remained valid regardless of who had arrived first. They took their own observations. They calculated their position with theodolite and compass, confirming that they stood at the pole, or as close to it as their instruments could determine. They planted the Union Jack, arranged themselves for photographs, tried to summon expressions of dignity rather than defeat. The photographs from that day are haunting. 5 men in heavy clothing, their faces weathered and gaunt, standing beside their flag. There is no joy in their expressions, only exhaustion and something else, a quiet acceptance of what could not be changed. They spent a short time at the pole, less than a day. There was no reason to linger. The return journey awaited, 800 miles of ice between them and safety. Every hour mattered now. Before departing, they built a small cairn and left a note recording their arrival. They took a final look at the Norwegian tent, that black shape against the white horizon. Then they turned north. The journey home would be harder than the journey out. They knew this. Their supplies were calculated precisely, with little margin for error. They were already tired, already depleted. The season was advancing. Autumn would come, and with it, colder temperatures, shorter days, fiercer storms. But there was no choice. They could only move forward, or rather backward, retracing their steps across the plateau, down the glacier, across the barrier. Scott recorded his thoughts that evening in the tent. The disappointment was profound, but he tried to find perspective. They had done something extraordinary. They had reached the pole. They would return with valuable scientific data. The expedition was not a failure. Yet the word failure hung in the air unspoken. They began the march north on January 18. Behind them, the Norwegian flag receded into the distance, growing smaller and smaller until it vanished entirely. The pole was empty again. The ice resumed its ancient silence. They stand in silence. We stand with them, asking nothing. The return journey began in somber spirits. The men had accomplished their goal, reaching the pole, but the victory belonged to someone else. Now they faced the long march home, 800 miles of ice and cold, with diminishing supplies and deteriorating strength. They retraced their outward tracks, following the line of cairns and depots they had established on the way south. Each depot meant food, fuel, survival. The distances between them seemed longer now, the miles harder. The weather began to turn. Clouds gathered more frequently, obscuring the sun and making navigation difficult. Temperatures dropped, -30, -35, colder than they had experienced on the outward journey. The surface conditions worsened. A thin layer of loose snow, almost like sand, covered the harder ice beneath. The sledge runners dragged through this surface, requiring far more effort to pull. progress slowed. They had calculated their rations carefully. So many days of food between each depot, so many miles to cover each day. But the slower pace meant burning calories faster than anticipated. The margins were shrinking. Frostbite began to appear. Fingers and toes, noses and cheeks, exposed skin suffered first. The men treated themselves as best they could, but the cold was relentless. Damaged tissue did not heal in these conditions. Evans was struggling. The cut on his hand from the glacier had become infected. He seemed confused at times, his movements clumsy. The altitude and cold were affecting him more than the others. Oates said little about his feet, but his gait had changed. He walked stiffly, favoring his damaged extremities. At night, when he removed his boots, the others caught glimpses of blackened toes. Wilson remained calm, steady, the moral center of the group. He encouraged the others, kept spirits as high as possible, attended to injuries with the limited medical supplies available. Bowers hauled with undiminished energy. His small frame seemed immune to the hardships that affected the others. He remained cheerful, optimistic, refusing to acknowledge despair. Scott drove himself hardest of all. He was the leader, the burden was his. He calculated and recalculated, measured their progress, worried over every detail. Sleep came poorly, and he rose early to face each new day. The plateau seemed endless. Day after day they marched north, and the horizon never changed. The same white expanse, the same low sun, the same bitter cold. They passed their outward camps, recognizing landmarks, a particular sastrugi formation, a cairn they had built, ski tracks now half buried by drift. Each recognition was a small victory, proof that they were making progress. But the progress was too slow. The food was running low between depots. The fuel was disappearing faster than expected. The cold meant longer cooking times, more melting of snow for water. Scott began to ration more strictly. Smaller portions, less hot drink, every ounce mattered now. The men did not complain. They understood the situation. They hauled and marched and endured, trusting in their leader, trusting in each other. The pole was behind them now, receding with each step. Ahead lay the glacier, the barrier, the coast, and home. If they could reach it. North now, every step a step toward home, rest easy. Edgar Evans had been the strongest of them. A big man, a petty officer, he had served with Scott on the Discovery expedition and proved himself invaluable. His hands were skilled with equipment repair. His strength was legendary. He could haul loads that staggered other men. But on the return journey, something changed. The decline was gradual at first. Evans seemed slower, less focused. He stumbled where he had once walked surely. His hands, those capable hands, fumbled with simple tasks. The cut he had received on the glacier, a gash across his knuckles, had never healed properly. In the cold, wounds did not close. Infection set in, spreading slowly through damaged tissue. And there may have been more. A fall on the glacier, perhaps, that caused injury no one could see. A blow to the head, internal damage. Whatever the cause, Evans was failing. The others tried to help. They redistributed weight, taking more onto their own sledge. They slowed the pace, allowing him to keep up. But there was a limit to what could be done. Every delay cost them time, cost them food, cost them the margin between survival and disaster. By mid-February, Evans could barely walk. He fell repeatedly, struggled to rise, stumbled on. His speech became confused. He seemed not to understand where he was, what was happening. On February 17, 1912, the party stopped early. Evans had collapsed again, unable to continue. They made camp and put him in the tent, hoping rest would help. It did not. Edgar Evans died that evening quietly, without regaining full consciousness. The cause was never precisely determined. Exhaustion, exposure, infection, head injury. Perhaps all of these, combined in the cruel mathematics of polar survival. The remaining 4 buried him in the snow. There was no wood for a cross, no ceremony beyond a few words spoken into the wind. They marked the spot as best they could, knowing the ice would cover it soon. Scott wrote of Evans with respect and sorrow. He had been a good man, a loyal companion. His death diminished them all. But there was no time for extended mourning. The living had to continue. The depots awaited. The coast was still hundreds of miles away. 4 men now, where 5 had been. The sledge was lighter by one man's weight of supplies, but heavier by the loss of his strength for hauling. They pressed on northward. The glacier descent continued, treacherous and slow. Crevasses threatened with every step. The cold intensified. Evans was the first. He would not be the last. The wind blew across the glacier, carrying snow in gentle streams. The 4 men moved forward, their shadows long on the ice, their breath freezing in the air. Behind them, a grave unmarked by any stone. Ahead, the barrier and the uncertain hope of home. Some journeys end quietly. We honor that silence. Lawrence Oates had known for weeks that his feet were dying. The frostbite had begun early in the return journey, perhaps even before they reached the pole. His toes had blackened, the tissue destroyed by cold. Each day the damage spread. Walking became agony. He said nothing, or almost nothing. That was his way. Oates was a cavalry officer, trained to endure, trained to keep private pain private. He had survived wounds in the Boer War without complaint. He would survive this. But he could not survive this. The gangrene crept up his feet toward his ankles. The pain was constant, burning, impossible to ignore. Yet he marched, he hauled. He did his share, or tried to. The others knew something was wrong. They saw his hesitation each morning as he forced ruined feet into frozen boots. They saw his grimace with each step, but they did not know how bad it truly was. Oates understood the arithmetic of their situation. Every day of delay reduced their chances of survival. Every mile he slowed them brought death closer for all. His presence had become a burden on men he respected and loved. He considered solutions. A doctor might amputate, but there was no doctor. Morphine might dull the pain, but they had none. The only solution that would help his companions was one he could barely contemplate. On March 16, 1912, his 32nd birthday, Lawrence Oates made his decision. They were camped in their tent, a blizzard raging outside. The wind howled across the barrier, driving snow against the canvas with a sound like sand. Visibility was zero. Travel was impossible. Oates had barely slept. The pain in his feet was beyond description. He knew he could not continue much farther. He knew what had to be done. He turned to his companions. "I am just going outside," he said. "I may be some time." Then he opened the tent flap and walked into the blizzard. They never saw him again. Scott wrote of this moment with profound respect. He called it the act of a brave man and an English gentleman. Whether those words capture the full complexity of Oates' choice, the desperation, the love, the sacrifice, is impossible to say. What is certain is that Oates walked into the storm believing his death would give his companions a better chance of survival. He removed himself from the equation, hoping the others might find the margin they needed. It was not enough, but he could not have known that. The three remaining men, Scott, Wilson, Bowers, waited out the blizzard. When it cleared, they searched briefly for Oates, knowing they would not find him. The snow had covered everything. They left a cairn to mark the approximate location. They recorded his death in their journals. They continued north, 3 where 4 had been, knowing now that time was running out. Oates' sleeping bag lay flat and empty in the tent. His boots remained unworn. He had walked into the storm in his socks, welcoming the cold that would end his suffering. The wind spoke no judgment. It simply blew, carrying snow across the barrier, covering tracks, erasing evidence. The ice accepted all sacrifices equally. 3 men remained. The depot at 1 ton was 11 miles away. It held food and fuel that could save them. 11 miles, so close, so impossibly far. The wind speaks no judgment. Let it carry you gently toward sleep. On March 19, 1912, the 3 remaining men made their final camp. They were 11 miles from 1 ton depot, 11 miles from food and fuel that would sustain them, 11 miles from a chance at survival. But a blizzard had descended, and they could not move. The storm raged for days. Wind speeds exceeded 70 miles per hour. Snow accumulated against the tent, threatening to bury it entirely. The temperature dropped to -40 and beyond. Inside the tent, Scott, Wilson, and Bowers waited. They had food for a day or two, fuel for 1 more hot meal. After that, nothing. They could not travel in the blizzard. To attempt it would be suicide. But staying meant slow starvation, slow freezing. They waited and they wrote. Scott's journal entries from these final days are among the most moving documents in the history of exploration. He wrote with clarity and calm, knowing these words might be his last, knowing they might be read by strangers long after he was gone. He wrote of the expedition's achievements, the scientific work, the specimens collected, the knowledge gained. He defended his decisions, explained his reasoning, acknowledged mistakes without self-pity. He wrote letters to the families of those who had died, to Evans's widow, to Oates' mother. He tried to offer comfort, to explain how bravely their men had faced the end. He wrote to his own wife, Kathleen, "I had looked forward to helping you bring up our boy. he said, "but it is a satisfaction to know that he will be brought up in the old country by you." He told her not to mourn too long, to live her life fully, to remarry if she wished. He wrote to friends, to expedition sponsors, to the British public. He explained what had happened, why they had failed to return. He asked that his companions' families be cared for, that the debts of the expedition be paid. And he wrote of courage. "We took risks," he said. "We knew we took them. Things have come out against us. We have no cause for complaint." Wilson and Bowers wrote as well. Their letters were private, intimate, never intended for public eyes. They expressed faith, love, acceptance. They said goodbye. The days passed. March 20, March 21, the blizzard continued. Their strength faded. At some point, the Primus stove ran dry. No more hot food, no more warm drink. The cold pressed in, relentless. They lay in their sleeping bags, conserving energy, waiting. Outside, the wind howled. Inside, the lantern guttered and went out. Scott's final journal entry was dated March 29, 1912. The handwriting was weaker, the words more difficult to form. "We shall stick it out to the end," he wrote, "but we are getting weaker, of course, and the end cannot be far." The last words in his journal: "For God's sake, look after our people." How long they survived after that entry is unknown. Perhaps a day, perhaps several. The cold would have taken them gently in the end, as hypothermia always does. A drowsiness, a confusion, a slipping away. The tent held them. The snow covered them. The silence of the barrier settled over all. They had come so close, 11 miles. In decent weather, 4 or 5 hours of marching. But the weather had not been decent, and now it did not matter. The lantern sat cold and dark. The pages of the journals lay still. Outside, the blizzard slowly exhausted itself, the wind dying to a whisper, the snow settling into stillness. 8 months would pass before anyone found them. Snow falls and falls. There is no sound but soft breathing. When the polar party did not return by autumn, those at Cape Evans began to worry. They had expected Scott and his companions in late March or early April. The days passed, and the hut remained silent. The sea ice began to form, sealing off any possibility of rescue by ship. The men at Cape Evans could only wait. Perhaps the polar party had been delayed. Perhaps they were sheltering at one of the depots. Perhaps they would appear any day, exhausted but alive. But they did not appear. The winter darkness descended once more. The surviving expedition members huddled in the hut, keeping scientific routines, trying to maintain hope. Some believed rescue was still possible. Others suspected the worst. With the return of spring in October 1912, a search party was organized. Led by Surgeon Edward Atkinson, 11 men set out across the barrier, following the route they knew so well. They found the tent on November 12, 1912. It was nearly buried by snow, just the peak visible above the drift. The search party dug carefully, not knowing what they would find. Inside were 3 bodies lying in their sleeping bags. Scott was in the middle, his arm extended across Wilson's body in a final gesture of companionship. The cold had preserved them. They looked almost peaceful, as if sleeping. The journals were there, the letters, the geological specimens that Wilson had hauled all the way from the Beardmore Glacier, even when every ounce mattered. 35 pounds of rocks that proved the ancient connection between Antarctica and other continents. Atkinson and the others read the journals standing in the cold beside the tent. They learned what had happened, the disappointment at the pole, the death of Evans, the sacrifice of Oates, the final blizzard. They collapsed the tent over the bodies, creating a burial cairn. They built a cross from skis and left a record of their discovery. Then they searched for Oates. They found his sleeping bag, his boots, but not his body. The snow had claimed him entirely. They built a cairn near the presumed location and left a note. Hereabouts died a very gallant gentleman. The search party returned to Cape Evans with the journals, letters, and specimens. They carried the story that would soon echo around the world. Before they departed Antarctica, they erected a cross on Observation Hill, overlooking the hut at Cape Evans. 9 feet tall, made of Terra wood from the ship, it bore an inscription from Tennyson: to strive, to seek, to find, and not to yield. The cross still stands there today, weathered but upright, facing south toward the pole that cost so much to reach. The expedition was over. The ship would sail north, carrying survivors and the dead men's words. But the story was just beginning. Months pass. The ice keeps its quiet vigil. The letters Scott wrote in his final days traveled slowly home. They crossed the Antarctic ice, sailed the Southern Ocean, passed through New Zealand and across the globe. Months after they were written, they reached the hands for which they were intended. Kathleen Scott received her husband's last words in February 1913, aboard a ship in the Pacific. She had been traveling to meet him, expecting his triumphant return. Instead, she received news of his death and the letters that would define his memory. He had written to her of their son Peter, expressing hope that the boy would grow to be interested in natural history, in the world's wonders. He had written of his love, his regrets, his acceptance of what could not be changed. The letters were intimate, tender, private, yet they would soon become public. Wilson's wife, Oriana, received letters filled with faith and peace. Wilson had faced death with the calm of a man certain of what lay beyond. His words offered comfort even as they confirmed loss. Bowers's mother learned of her son's courage, his inexhaustible energy, his cheerfulness even in the darkest hours. He had been the youngest of the polar party, just 28, and his letters radiated the optimism that had sustained his companions. The journals were published within a year of the expedition's return. They became immediate bestsellers, read by millions, translated into languages around the world. Scott's words resonated with a public hungry for heroism, for tales of sacrifice and endurance. Memorial services were held across Britain. In St. Paul's Cathedral, crowds gathered to honor the dead. The king sent condolences. Statues were commissioned. Streets were named. The 5 men who had died on the ice became national heroes. The story told in those early years was one of noble failure, of British courage tested against impossible odds. Scott was portrayed as a tragic hero, a man who had done everything right but been defeated by fate and weather. Later generations would question this narrative. Was Scott's planning adequate? Were his decisions sound? The reliance on ponies, the late addition of a fifth man, the placement of one-ton depot, all would be analyzed and debated. Amundsen's success invited comparison. The Norwegian had reached the pole first, returned safely, lost no men. His approach was different, dogs instead of ponies, a single-minded focus on the pole rather than scientific objectives, a more efficient use of resources. Some concluded that Amundsen was simply better at polar travel. Others argued that Scott faced worse luck, worse weather, circumstances beyond his control. The debate continues to this day. But perhaps the debate misses the point. The men of the Terra Nova expedition did not die in vain. The scientific specimens they collected, those 35 pounds of rocks Wilson refused to abandon, proved invaluable. The fossils contained within them demonstrated that Antarctica had once been connected to other continents, part of a supercontinent called Gondwana. This discovery supported the theory of continental drift, now accepted as scientific fact. The meteorological data, the biological observations, the geological surveys, all contributed to human knowledge. The expedition advanced understanding of one of Earth's least known regions. And the story itself had value. It reminded people of what could be achieved through determination and sacrifice. It offered an example of courage that generations would draw upon in their own trials. The letters traveled home, carrying grief and love across the miles. The words found their recipients, offered what comfort they could, and then they passed into history to be read and pondered and debated for over a century. Words travel slowly home. Let them settle like snow on still water. The news reached civilization on February 10, 1913. Terra Nova had sailed into the port of Oamaru, New Zealand, and the first telegraph cables carried the story to London, then around the world. Within hours, newspapers on every continent were printing the headlines. Captain Scott dead, British explorers perish at the pole, heroic end in the Antarctic. The reaction was immediate and overwhelming. In Britain, a nation already anxious about its place in a changing world, the story struck with particular force. Scott and his companions had died doing what the British believed they did best, facing impossible odds with quiet courage. Flags flew at half-mast. Church bells tolled. Theaters observed moments of silence before performances. The story dominated conversation in homes and workplaces, in pubs and parlors. The king issued a statement expressing the nation's grief. The prime minister spoke in parliament. Funds were established to support the families of the dead, and the public contributed generously, moved by the tale of sacrifice they had read in the journals. The narrative that emerged was one of heroism untainted by failure. Yes, Amundsen had arrived first, but Scott had died like a gentleman, writing letters in his tent, comforting his companions, facing the end without complaint. This, the public felt was what mattered. The bodies would not be retrieved. It was understood that they would remain in their tent on the barrier, eventually buried by accumulating snow, eventually carried by the glacier's slow movement toward the sea. The ice would be their tomb, their monument. Memorial services were held not only in Britain, but across the empire, in Australia, New Zealand, South Africa, Canada. The explorers had become symbols, their story claimed by all who valued courage and endurance. Monuments were erected. In London, a statue of Scott was unveiled in Waterloo Place. In Cardiff, where the expedition had departed, a lighthouse memorial was built. In Antarctica itself, the cross on Observation Hill kept its silent watch. The families of the dead navigated their grief in public. Kathleen Scott, strong-willed and independent, channeled her sorrow into raising her son and pursuing her career as a sculptor. She remarried years later, finding happiness despite her loss. Peter Scott, the son who never knew his father, grew up to become a renowned naturalist and conservationist. He founded the World Wildlife Fund and dedicated his life to protecting the natural world his father had explored. The story of the Terra Nova expedition became part of British identity, taught in schools, referenced in speeches, invoked in times of national trial. During the world wars that followed, Scott's words were quoted as examples of courage under adversity. "We took risks. We knew we took them. Things have come out against us. We have no cause for complaint." These sentences resonated through decades, offering a model of acceptance, of grace in defeat. The headlines faded. The immediate grief softened. But the story remained, passed from generation to generation, debated and reinterpreted but never forgotten. Headlines fade. What remains is simply memory, resting gently. While Scott and his companions struggled on the barrier, another story was unfolding. Roald Amundsen had approached the pole with a different philosophy. He was a professional explorer, experienced in polar conditions, unsentimental about the means necessary for success. His expedition was designed with a single objective: reach the pole first and return safely. He established his base at the Bay of Whales, on the barrier itself, a controversial choice, as the ice there was less stable than the land of Ross Island, but it gave him a 60-mile head start on Scott. His team was smaller, more experienced. His transport relied entirely on dogs, over 100 of them, trained and disciplined. His depots were more numerous, more carefully placed. His rations were calculated with ruthless precision. Amundsen departed for the pole on October 19, 1911, nearly 2 weeks before Scott. His team traveled fast, covering 20 miles a day on good surfaces. The dogs pulled strongly, requiring no man-hauling from the humans. When the dogs were no longer needed, they were killed and fed to the surviving animals and to the men themselves. It was practical, efficient, unsqueamish. It was also the difference between carrying enough food and running short. Amundsen reached the South Pole on December 14, 1911. He spent 3 days there, taking observations, confirming his position, planting the Norwegian flag. Then he turned north and headed home. The return journey was swift and uneventful. Amundsen arrived back at his base on January 25, 1912, the same day Scott was still struggling across the polar plateau, weeks from his goal. There was no tragedy in Amundsen's story. All 5 members of his polar party returned alive. They had achieved their objective with time and supplies to spare. Yet Amundsen's success was overshadowed by Scott's death. The public imagination was captured not by efficiency but by sacrifice, not by victory but by noble failure. Amundsen was respected but not beloved. Scott became a legend. This imbalance troubled Amundsen. He had done everything right, and yet he was remembered as a footnote to another man's tragedy. In his later years, he seemed haunted by this irony. The 2 expeditions represented different philosophies: British romanticism versus Norwegian pragmatism, man-hauling versus dog power, scientific breadth versus geographical focus. Neither approach was wrong. They were simply different. Both men were brave. Both men were determined. Both men sought the same goal. One succeeded and lived. One succeeded and died. The ice made no distinction. It accepted all who came, tested all equally, kept its secrets from all but the most determined seekers. Amundsen would die in 1928 on a rescue mission in the Arctic, lost in the ice he had spent his life exploring. The parallel was not lost on those who remembered both men. 2 paths across the ice, 2 journeys to the same point, 2 legacies intertwined forever. 2 paths across the ice, both deserve our quiet attention. Amid the tragedy, there was treasure. When the search party found Scott's tent, they discovered not only journals and letters but 35 pounds of geological specimens. Wilson had collected them on the Beardmore Glacier, carrying them across the polar plateau and back, refusing to abandon them even when every ounce of weight mattered. These rocks contained fossils, the imprints of ancient plants, preserved for millions of years in Antarctic stone. Among them was Glossopteris, a seed fern that had flourished when Antarctica was warm, when forests grew where ice now reigned. The same fossil had been found in South America, Africa, India, and Australia. Its presence on every southern continent suggested something remarkable, that these landmasses had once been connected, part of a single supercontinent now called Gondwana. This was evidence for continental drift, the theory that the Earth's continents had moved over geological time, breaking apart and colliding in slow motion. In 1912, the theory was controversial, dismissed by many geologists as fantasy. The fossils Wilson carried helped change that. Today, we understand that Antarctica once lay near the equator, covered in forests, home to diverse life. The movement of tectonic plates carried it south, into cold and ice. The fossils in Wilson's collection are windows into that distant past. The expedition's scientific contributions extended beyond geology. Simpson's meteorological observations improved understanding of Antarctic weather patterns. Ponting's photographs documented ice formations and wildlife with unprecedented clarity. The biological specimens collected at Cape Evans expanded knowledge of polar ecosystems. Science had been central to the expedition's purpose from the beginning. Scott had insisted on comprehensive research programs, even when they complicated the race to the pole. The scientists on his team were not passengers but full participants, their work considered essential. This commitment to science was part of Scott's legacy, sometimes overlooked in favor of the adventure narrative, but no less significant. The expedition advanced human knowledge in ways that long outlasted the controversy over who reached the pole first. The specimens eventually found their way to museums and research institutions. They were studied by generations of scientists, yielding insights that Wilson could not have imagined. The rocks he carried across the ice became evidence in debates that shaped modern geology. And the tradition continued. Antarctica today hosts research stations from dozens of nations, studying climate, ice, atmosphere, and life. The continent has become a laboratory for understanding Earth's past and future. Scott and his companions did not live to see this legacy, but they helped create it through their observations, their collections, their willingness to prioritize knowledge alongside glory. The rocks rest now in museum drawers, labeled and cataloged. The fossils preserve life from an age before ice, and the science goes on, building on foundations laid over a century ago. Stones carried across a continent, knowledge resting in museum drawers. The hut at Cape Evans still stands. More than a century after Scott's expedition, the prefabricated building remains on its volcanic spit, facing McMurdo Sound as it did in 1911. The cold has preserved it, frozen in time like a museum diorama. Inside, objects wait exactly where they were left. Tins of food line the shelves: Huntley and Palmer's biscuits, Coleman's mustard, Fry's cocoa. The labels are faded but legible. The contents, remarkably, remain edible. Wilson's laboratory still holds specimen jars and microscopes. Ponting's darkroom still smells faintly of chemicals. The long table where men gathered for meals and lectures stands in the center of the room, surrounded by benches worn smooth by use. Bunks line the walls, blankets neatly folded. Personal items, photographs, books, shaving kits, remain on shelves beside each bed. It is as if the occupants stepped out for a moment and never returned, which in a sense they did not. The preservation is deliberate. The Antarctic Heritage Trust, based in New Zealand, has undertaken extensive conservation work, stabilizing structures, protecting artifacts, ensuring that this window into the past remains open for future generations. Visitors are rare. Antarctica is not easily accessible, but those who come report a powerful sense of presence. The men who lived here, who planned and dreamed and died, seem almost tangible. Their possessions speak across the century. The pony harnesses hang on hooks near the door. The coal stove, source of so much warmth during the long winter nights, stands cold but intact. The acetylene generator that powered the lights is still recognizable. And the journals, copies now, the originals safely preserved elsewhere, record what happened here. The routines, the celebrations, the fears, the hopes. Outside, Mount Erebus still smokes against the sky. The ice shelf stretches south toward the pole. Penguins waddle past the hut, indifferent to its history. The cross on Observation Hill is visible from Cape Evans, standing against the horizon. It marks the expedition's end, but also its continuity, a physical link between past and present. The hut is more than a building. It is a memorial, a time capsule, a reminder of what was attempted and what was lost. It asks nothing of those who visit. It simply exists, patient and silent, keeping its vigil. Someday the ice may claim it. The glacier moves, the climate shifts, the future is uncertain. But for now, the hut stands and the objects within wait for eyes that may or may not come. The hut still stands. Nothing asks to be disturbed. And so we come to the end of this journey. We have traveled together across more than a century, following 5 men to the bottom of the world and back, or as close to back as they could come. We have seen them prepare with hope, march with determination, reach their goal with disappointment, and return with courage. We have stood with them in the tent at the pole, in the blizzard that took oats, in the final camp where the last words were written. Robert Falcon Scott, Edward Adrian Wilson, Lawrence Edward Grace Oates, Henry Robertson Bowers, Edgar Evans, these were their names, these were their lives. They did not achieve what they set out to achieve, not entirely. Another man planted his flag first. The race was lost before it was known. But they achieved something else. They demonstrated what human beings can endure. They gathered knowledge that outlasted their own lives. They left letters that still move readers today. And they left questions about planning and luck, about different ways of facing challenges, about what it means to succeed and what it means to fail. We offer no final answers. The ice keeps its secrets. The past does not explain itself. What we can say is that they tried. They gave everything they had. And when the end came, they faced it with dignity. The pole still stands at 90 degrees south, empty, windswept, cold beyond imagining. The ice moves slowly toward the sea, carrying with it the tent that was never retrieved. And the story remains, passed from those who knew it to those who listen now. It is a quiet story, finally, a story of walking into silence. Thank you for walking with us tonight. May your own journey, wherever it leads, be gentle. Their journey ends. Yours continues gently into rest.